Okay, we're back, and right now we're reading 1912 essay by Henri Bergson, and right now Henri Bergson is talking in the voice of a critique. He's trying to put out the best possible objections which might be made against his philosophical position. So he's saying the opposite of pretty much the opposite, or what is in opposition to his own beliefs. He's trying to give the the benefit of the doubt, or the best possible, put the arguments of his opponents in the best possible light by speaking through the voice of another, in a sense. So this is what the materialist would say in reply to what Bergson has said so far. And he says, the truth is that we could look through the skull and observe the inner working of the brain with instruments magnifying some billion times more than our most powerful microscopes. If we then should witness the dance of the molecules and atoms and electrons of which the cerebral cortex is composed, and if in addition we possessed the rule for transposing the cerebral into the mental, a dictionary, so to speak, which would enable us to translate each figure of the dance into the language of thought and feeling, we should know quite as well as the supposed soul what it was thinking, feeling, and wishing, what it would be believing itself doing freely, though it would only be acting mechanically in reality. We should know it, indeed, much better than it could know itself, for this so-called conscious soul lights up only a small part of the intra-cerebral dance. The soul is only the assemblage of will-o'-the-wisps, ghosts which hover above certain privileged groups of atoms, whereas we should be observing all the groups of all the atoms, the whole intracerebral dance with our powerful microscopes. Says which is relevant today, as we're seeing the popularity of fMRI technology take off, right, in neuroscience. He says, your conscious soul is at most an effect which perceives effects. We should be seeing the effects and the causes if we had the ultra fMRI. Okay, so that's the end of the critique part. He says that the critique basically at the end says, what you call the conscious soul is at most just an effect which perceives effects. It has no power. It's nothing transcendent. All we would be seeing if we looked inside the brain, we would see the effects and the causes. We would know more about consciousness than consciousness could by looking at the material atoms. And he says that's the end of the critique. Now Bergson is speaking again in his own voice. He says, this is what is sometimes said to be the name of this is what is sometimes said in the name of science. But it is not clear that if by scientific we mean what is observed or observable, demonstrated or demonstratable, then a theory such as we have just sketched is not scientific, for in the present state of science we cannot even have a notion of the possibility of verifying it. It is alleged, it is true, that the law of conservation of energy is opposed to the idea that even the smallest quantity of force or movement is created in the universe, and that if things did not behave mechanically in the manner just stated, and if an efficient will could intervene to perform free actions, the law of the conservation of energy would be violated. But to reason thus is simply to beg the question, for the law of the conservation of energy, like all physical laws, is no more than a deduction from observations of physical phenomena. It expresses what happens in a domain wherein no one has ever held that there was caprice, choice, or liberty. It expresses what happens in a domain wherein no one has ever held, in the physical domain, has ever held that there is caprice, choice, or liberty. And what precisely we want to know is whether it can still be verified in the cases in which consciousness, which, after all, is a faculty of observation and which experiments in its own way, we want to know whether it can still be verified in the cases in which consciousness feels itself in possession of a free activity. can the law of conservation of energy uh, be verified in the cases in which consciousness feels itself in possession of a free activity. Now, whatever is directly presented to the senses or to consciousness, whatever is an object of experience, whether external or internal, it must be held to be real so long as it has not been proved to be a simple appearance. Now, that we feel ourselves free, that such is our immediate impression, is not in doubt. On those who hold that the feeling is illusory, the feeling of free will is illusory, then falls the onus of proof. And they can prove nothing of the kind, since all they can do is to extend arbitrarily to voluntary actions a law verified in cases in which the will does not intervene, in involuntary cases. I quite agree that if the will is capable of creating energy, the quantity created may be so small that it would not affect sensibly our instruments of measurement. Yet its effect might be enormous, like that of a spark which explodes a powder magazine. So it's interesting, he's talking about basically the sensitivity to initial conditions, which we've just now started to understand 100, say 80 years after Bergson has been writing. He was, of course, trained as a mathematician, so he knows a lot about mathematics and things like and dynamic systems and things like this. He says that the will might have a very small effect, such a small effect on energy that we can't observe it. We don't have instruments sensitive enough to pick up on it. But its effect could be enormous, like that of a spark which explodes a powder magazine. I will not enter into a thorough investigation of this point. It is enough for me to say that when we consider the mechanism of voluntary movement in particular, the functioning of the nervous system in general, and in fact life itself in what is essential to it, we are led to the conclusion that the invariable contrivance of consciousness, from its most humble origin and elementary living forms, is to convert physical determinism to its own ends. Or rather, to elude the law of conservation of energy whilst obtaining from matter a fabrication of explosives, ever intenser and more utilizable. So again, we'll say this again. He says, it is enough for me to say that when we consider the mechanism of voluntary movement in particular, or the functioning of the nervous system in general, or in fact life itself in what is essential to it, we are led to the conclusion that the invariable contrivance of consciousness, from its most humble origin and elementary living forms, is to convert physical determinism into its own ends, or rather, to elude the law of conservation of energy, whilst obtaining from matter a fabrication of explosives or of energy, units of energy, ever intenser, more intense, more and more utilizable for its own ends. It will then require an almost negligible action, such as the slight pressure of the finger on the hair trigger of a pistol, in order to liberate at the required moment, in the direction chosen, as great an amount as is warranted of accumulated energy. So he's saying that life will just have a small hair trigger pistol, and boom, it'll release all this energy that it's been saving up. He says the glycogen the glycogen lodged in the muscles is in fact a real explosive. By it voluntary movement is accomplished. To make and utilize explosives of this kind seems to be the unvarying and essential preoccupation of life. From its first apparition in protoplasmic masses, deformable at will, to its complete expansion in organisms capable of free actions.